we want to spend a few minutes talking about independent and dependent variables. You're going to talk about this in my class this year. You're also going to talk about this in science. These sort of go together. Math and science are related. They use each other quite frequently, okay? And what we want to be able to do today is we want to identify independent and dependent variables. Okay? Now, what does it mean to be independent? If you are independent, that means you don't need nobody else to do nothing, right? Pardon my grammar. You don't need anybody to help you, you just do what you need to do. You are independent. If you are dependent on somebody or something, you need it. They have to be around in order for you to get done what you need to get done. Sort of the same idea, and that's where we're going to go with independent and dependent variable. Now, the independent variable is always going to be from the domain. Independent variable is always going to be where the domain comes from, which means it's going to be which values? Your x values. Your x values are always going to be your independent variable, okay? Which means your dependent variable is going to be the range, and it's going to come from your y values, right? So independent goes with your x values, dependent goes with your y values. That's important because that will help us set up graphs when we try to do graphs. Here are two ways that we can word that and be able to tell if I don't know if be able to tell, but the ways to word about y being the dependent variable. Two different phrases you can use. You can say y depends on x, okay, because it's the dependent variable, it depends on x. Or you can say, this is the more mathy sounding way, y is a function of x. Y depends on x, or y is a function of x. X is always your independent variable. X is always your independent variable. Y is always your dependent variable. So y depends on x, or y is a function of x. What does this look like? Well, let's look at three different situations here. It says for each of the following situations, part A, identify the independent and dependent variable, and then B, write a sentence given the relationship between the two variables using the words is a function of. Okay? So they give us two things here, spring rainfall and wildflowers. And you've got to decide which one's independent and which one's dependent. Now remember, independent means it doesn't need anything. It's just going to happen. And dependent means it needs the other one in order to happen. Well, think about rain and think about wildflowers. Which one's just going to happen and which one needs the other in order to happen? What do you think? Did you think that the dependent variable is going to be wildflowers and the independent variable is going to be the spring rainfall? Here's how I came up with that. It's going to rain when it rains, right? Does rain need wildflowers in order to happen? No. Rain is independent. It's going to happen when it happens. Wildflowers are dependent on rainfall. You're not going to have wildflowers if you don't have rain. So if we write our sentence where it says write a sentence using the words is a function of, we could say wildflowers are a function of rainfall. And remember, we're using the a function of in place of depends on. We could say wildflowers depends on rainfall. So mathematically speaking, wildflowers are a function of rainfall. Okay? Now, look at the second one here. The amount of money spent and the number of articles of clothing bought. I want you to decide which one's independent, which one's dependent. Write that on your notes. Then write your sentence. Then turn your video back on and check it. This is what I got. Now, I will agree with this one. You could almost argue either way, and sometimes there are cases where you can argue either way. The word I focused on here was the amount of money spent. Okay, it's in past tense. It's how much you spent. Well, how much you spend depends on how much you buy, right? How much you spend depends on how much you buy. So I said that the dependent variable was the amount of money spent, and the independent variable was how many clothes you buy. Now, I agree, if you don't have any money, you can't buy any clothes, but it's not how much money you have, it's how much you actually spent. So I focused on this word here when I decided my dependent and independent variable. So I wrote my sentence, the amount of money spent is a function of how many clothes were bought, because the amount of money I spent depends on how many clothes I bought. All right? Do the last one. The amount of stagnant water, that means water just sitting around, and the number of mosquito larvae. Decide which one's independent, which one's dependent. Write your sentence. I decided my dependent variable was the number of mosquito larvae. It depends on how much water's standing around. If you have a lot of stagnant water, you're going to have a lot of mosquitoes. If you have less stagnant water, you'll have less mosquitoes. So my independent variable is the amount of stagnant water, and my sentence is the number of mosquito larvae is a function of the amount of stagnant water, because the number of mosquito larvae depends on the amount of stagnant water. Okay? If you have any questions, write it here. We'll go over these notes in class tomorrow.